Next, we will talk about these two different models. We will delve into the details. The general adversarial network and the variational encoders, they both aim to characterize distributions and learn high-dimensional distributions. The general adversarial networks is a sampling method that tries to sample from distribution. The variational encoder, on the other hand, tries to really estimate the distribution, so we will be able to estimate the likelihood of a sample, as well as sampling from the distribution as well. And we will see how those work. To understand these models, we will have to understand what's called the latent variable model. Now, we've said that images live in a high-dimensional space. If I talk about a 64 by 64 image, that actually has 4,096 dimensions, and 4,096 pixels. And if I assume each of those pixels can take anywhere a real value, that's 4,096 dimensions. The idea about the latent variable models is it assumes that images live in a lower dimensional subspace that's shown by this latent space. So here, images actually live in a lower dimensional subspace that's small d dimensional, and actually I can convert it to the real image space that I observe through a transformation and get this curved subspace that is embedded in the 4,096 dimensional image space, but actually covers a much smaller area here. Now, given a simple distribution in the latent space, I can compute the likelihood of a given sample by simply integrating out the z from the joint distribution. So I have a P of z, that's defined on the z, and that's a simple distribution, as I said. I have the transformation from z to x, and I have a probability distribution that evaluates the likelihood of an x for a given z. And when I integrate out z, I simply get the likelihood value of x. Usually in these models, it is assumed that the latent dimension is much, much smaller than the real image dimension. Before delving into the details, how actually those transformations are constructed, let us try to get an intuition by what I mean by this lower dimensional subspace in the image space. Assume that actually this slide represents the 4,096 dimensional image space. Okay, so that's the RD. And assume that my images live in a smaller area in this curved geometric object. That's where my plausible images live in. If I look at the sample here, those are actually images that look real. For example, these are image patches that are taken from a brain with a magnetic resonance image device. So these patches, they look real, they look plausible. They can be actually samples from around this X that I showed you. Right? If I look at another area here, that's actually not in the plausible image set, that still lives in this 4,096 dimensional space, but just not on what we call real images, then they might actually look like what we see on the right-hand side, so pure noise. Now, how do we actually create this transformation from the latent space to image space? Because that seems to be the most crucial aspect of it. So I have to go from the lower dimensional latent space to the higher dimensional image space. We've actually seen a model that's able to do this, and that's called principal component analysis, or rather the probabilistic version of it. The idea is to assume a linear mapping between the latent space and the image space, which means that I take this latent space and simply rotate it and translate it and put it in another place in the image space. Now, the probabilistic formula remains the same. Now, this probabilistic component analysis was published in first 1999, and the idea is quite simple. Well, for the transformation, I simply use a linear model. I take Z, multiply it by a transformation matrix W, and add a mu x to it, simple translation. And that's the mean of a Gaussian distribution in the image space. Now, it assumes that in Z, in the latent space, I have a very simple distribution. For example, a Gaussian with 0 mean and identity covariance matrix. And the model parameter is this transformation matrix. Now, it's actually linked very much to the principal component analysis. If I have a set of samples, and if I actually find the maximum likelihood estimate of the parameters of the probabilistic principal component analysis, I get the same results as PCA, meaning that the transformation matrix is actually formed by the eigenvectors and the eigenvalues of the PCA model. It also includes the noise distribution here, so the standard deviation in the image space, as well as an arbitrary rotation matrix. Okay. You don't really have to get into the details of these equations. I wouldn't ask them in the exam, obviously. But if you're curious about the derivations, you can look at the paper of Tipping and Bishop from 1999. In the supervised learning, we've seen that these linear maps were not enough to do good classification. And the same thing applies to unsupervised learning as well. Instead of linear maps, we actually would like to be able to model nonlinear maps that take the latent space to the image space, and simply, instead of taking it to a hyperplane, just a rotation in the higher dimensional space, it actually creates a curved geometry. The only thing from the mathematical point of view that changes, or from the equations that changes, is that I still have a Gaussian distribution in the image space, but this time, instead of a linear map, I basically feed Z into a nonlinear map, and that forms the transformation from the latent space to the image space. And everything else remains the same. Now, this idea actually is not new. It's actually even older than the probabilistic PCA. In 1995, David McKay proposed what's called density networks. The idea is exactly what I described. I take Z, and now I define a neural network that takes Z into or transform it to the image, and at the end, I define a distribution in the image space. Given a number of samples, I can actually determine the parameters of this neural network by maximizing the likelihood values for the samples. What that means, I have the probabilities of each X, each sample, and I try to maximize this probability for each of them. If I assume that they're independent samples, I can basically write the joint distribution as a product, as we see here. And each of these actually means that there's an integral over the Z space. If the Z, or the latent dimension, is not very low, even 5 or 10 is enough, finding this integral explicitly or analytically might be impossible, and computing numerically accurate is also difficult. Instead, what David McKay does is to use Monte Carlo integration. What that means is I sample from Z, and I evaluate Px given Z, like the version shown here. Now, this was efficient for lowish dimensional latent spaces, but the sampling is not efficient for even slightly large dimensional problems. If Z has 25 dimensions, then this Monte Carlo integration will also be not efficient. McKay hinted what's called to something importance sampling. And that led to the development of variational autoencoders. It really builds on this density network concept, and instead of Monte Carlo integration, it uses this variational inference, which can be seen simply as application of Jensen's inequality on importance sampling. Now, the idea is actually quite simple. Remember, I wanted to evaluate the log, or like the probability of given X, or the log likelihood as shown in this case. And that's kind of the log of this integral. Instead of actually sampling from Z, what we do here is we assume that we will not sample from Z, but we will sample from a distribution where Px given Z's will be high enough. So I will sample from a distribution where kind of this integral will always, or integrand will always have high values. That's what's called the importance sampling. Now, the best option would be a posterior distribution to plug here, but we don't have access to posterior distributions Pz given X, so instead, we basically model or approximate the posterior distribution with another one, Q function. Now, Jensen's inequality says that I can actually take this logarithm inside the integral after some manipulation for concave functions, so the equality turns into an inequality. Then this gives me two terms actually. One of them is the expected value of the likelihood for a given Z, and the other one is the KL divergence between probability prior in Z, or the distribution in the latent space, and the posterior distribution that I approximate. Now, this is what's called the evidence lower bound. As I said, computing the log likelihood of a sample is impossible, but computing its lower bound is possible. So what this model says is, instead of maximizing this guy, you can simply maximize the lower bound. Okay? And if you maximize it enough, hopefully at some point, its limit, upper limit, will also go up. How is this implemented? Actually, I have two networks. One of them is the decoding network. That's what we've seen before. That converts a sample in the latent space into a sample in the image space, or rather the probability distribution in the image space. So it takes a lower dimensional representation and maps to an image. And this itself can be used as a sample, as you can imagine. And for the modeling of the Q, the posterior distribution, I have an encoding model which takes a sample in the image space and maps it to a distribution in the latent space. So it encodes the image to a lower dimensional space. So I have two sets of parameters here, and I will do exactly the same thing. I will maximize the lower bound for each of these samples, assuming that the samples are independent, and optimize the parameters so that the evidence lower bound for the samples are maximized. Now, in the original model, they use Gaussian distributions for both the approximate posterior distribution and also distribution in the image. But you can use any other type of distribution here. And notice that this is very much linked to the probabilistic PCA. The probabilistic PCA will have a Gaussian here and will have a Gaussian here as well. And the Gaussians, instead of having a nonlinear maps like this, they will actually have just linear maps. And notice that in the encoding model and decoding model, the networks actually kind of takes X and spits out the mean for this distribution in the posterior case and the covariance, and likewise the mean and the posterior and the covariance for the distribution in the image space. So how does actually integrating this nonlinear capability help? And here's some results of the generated image patches. On the left-hand side, you see some image patches that are taken from real images, so 28 by 28 image patches. On the right-hand side, you see probabilistic principal component analysis and the image patches that are generated or that are sampled from this model. And in the middle, you have samples that are created by a variation autoencoder, by this nonlinear mapping. They both use 60 components, meaning that the latent space has 60 dimensions. You can see that actually these samples from the VAE look very realistic compared to the PCA samples. You can imagine increasing the number of components or the latent dimensions and hope that the probabilistic PCA will get better samples, but that's not the case. Instead, the probabilistic PCA learns better the noise and is unable to really model the actual samples and create real-looking images. Now, the next model that we talked about was what's called the generative adversarial network. And here, instead of modeling an explicit probability distribution, generative adversarial network is a sampling tool. It simply takes random samples from a known distribution in the latent space and converts them into real-looking images, samples from the image distribution in a sense. And I have two networks. One of them is a generator and the other one is a discriminator. And these networks work together such that this generator in the end becomes a good sampler. The idea is simple. The generator will create samples in the X with a certain parameter setting here, and the discriminator will be able to distinguish between them, between generated samples and real images. Then, based on this, the generator will try to update its parameters such that it can fool the discriminator, and the discriminator will update its parameters such that it will not be fooled by the generator. This actually ends up being a min-max problem, like the one that's shown here, which I believe you've seen this equation last week in Professor Yu's lecture. Here, really, the idea is the generator and discriminator are in a two-player game that are competing with each other. At the end of this training, the generator here will be able to create real-looking images such that a neural network will not be able to distinguish them from real-looking images. Let's see some examples. Here in the original paper from Yin Goodfellow, they applied it to 4 different datasets, and these are the generations from them. On the top left, this is MNIST dataset, which contains images of handwritten digits, and they train the algorithm. And what we see on the right-hand side are basically samples generated by the algorithm. Here, the same thing for the face images. And here, you see the same thing for, I believe this is CFAR images and so on. Now, what we see here is if the content of the image is not very complicated, like a digit or even a human face, the generations look quite appealing. I mean, for the digits, for sure. And for the face, they also look quite appealing. When the content of the image gets more complicated, obviously, the generations are having a difficult time as well. But remember, this was end of 2013 and 2014. After that, quite a bit of effort has been made, and it's a very active area of research. And this is, for example, generation results, what we see on the left-hand side, from a paper that was published in 2018 from NVIDIA. And it's impressive that actually they're able to create such realistic-looking images just by sampling a generator. On the right-hand side, they played an interesting game as well. They try to interpolate between real images. So on the left here, you have real images, and on the right, you have real images. So you map them to the latent space and interpolate in between in the latent space, and for each of the values, you simply generate a new sample. Notice that all these images, they look like real faces. They are quite accurate and they're very detailed. And slowly, the face here is converted to the target one here. Now, these are the generative adversarial network and the variation autoencoders are two different models, but there's also another very interesting avenue for modeling distributions, which is called the flow-based models. And we will not go into detail, but I strongly recommend you to look into it if you are interested in this problem of distribution modeling. Next, I will talk about representation learning, but first I will upload this video.